Today we will be having as part of our monthly seminar series Scott Imberman from the University of Houston. And this seminar series is now twice a month. So the first Wednesday of each month and the third Friday of each month. And so if you want to check out our website for a current list of events, please feel free to do so. And there's bookmarks out front with that web address. And so Scott Imberman is, like I said, at University of Houston. He does a lot of research on the economics of education as well as public health and labor economics. And he's very interested in the issue of peer effects. And so that interest is manifest in the presentation today where we're looking at the effect of school uniforms. So welcome, Scott. Thank you for coming, and we're glad to have you.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me out here. I really appreciate giving me a chance today to present my work. Just to mention, this is a joint work with Elizabeth Gentile, who is a graduate student at University of Houston. And, excuse me, unfortunately I'm getting over a bit of a cold today, so forgive me if I'm a little hoarse. So I'm going to talk to you today about school uniforms, and in particular we're going to look at what the impact is of school uniforms on a host of student outcomes. A particular focus is going to be on student behavior and attendance with an addendum to achievement, and we're also going to be looking at how uniforms affect people's schooling decisions themselves, to which schools to attend. So increasingly, over the last decade or so, a little bit more, there's been a lot of more schools and districts that have been adopting uniforms over this time period. In 1996, you had only about 3% of public schools requiring uniforms. This is a little bit after the first large urban school district, Long Beach, California, to adopt uniforms made their decision. And when you forward a bit to 1996, it started becoming a much more national phenomenon as the President of the United States and the Department of Education made some pretty strident attempts to make it easier for schools to adopt uniforms. And as a result, by the time you get to 2005, we have 14% of public schools with uniforms. So essentially you have almost like a 350% increase over the course of less than 10 years. So a pretty substantial increase in uniform adoption across public schools. And now you have lots of large public school districts that are implementing uniforms. New York City requires uniforms for all their elementary students. Houston Independent School District, Philadelphia requires uniforms for all students. Chicago, Dallas ISD, as well as Boston. All these school districts at least have some schools that may require uniforms. Yeah.
Question: that 14%, is that by school districts or is by schools?
That's by schools. The number.
The schools, okay.
Yeah.
So you're counting elementary schools?
Yes. Yeah. Okay. I'm not making any distinction between the type of schools there.
Okay. So,
if you look into why schools adopt uniform and stuff, you'll see politicians and school administrators talking a lot about how their beliefs essentially that uniforms have led to improved behavior and higher test scores. If you look back at when New York City started adopting uniforms, the mayor at the time, Rudolph Giuliani, explicitly would talk about how he felt that the uniforms would improve student behavior and things like that. President Clinton, in his 1996 State of the Union address, actually basically said that, implied that uniforms were a way to prevent people from essentially stealing other people's jackets or things like that. His argument that if you don't actually have to bring the expensive jacket to school anymore, you're not going to have as much theft. Of course, as economists, we may think that there may also be potential spillovers from that as well. It's not just the theft directly of the jacket, but also could potentially have some general improvements in these misbehaviors. Despite the politicians and administrators, acceptance of uniforms, and a lot of whom, in a sense, swear by them, the empirical evidence is pretty limited and quite unclear. So there have only been a handful of papers that have really tried to establish what impact uniforms have on these student outcomes, and you see the list of them there. The problem with what we've seen before is that these papers potentially suffer from substantial bias. In general, we might think, although it's not necessarily the case, but we might think that schools that tend to have more uniform discipline problems and things like that may be more likely to adopt uniforms. And so if we do a standard just cross-sectional ordinary least squares analysis, if we're not controlling sufficiently for student characteristics, and even if we are controlling for a lot of characteristics, maybe still some unobserved characteristics of students in schools, that could lead us to underestimate the impact of uniforms. And not surprisingly, when you look at the Brunsma and Rockamore, the Brunsma and the Young papers, they find essentially a couple that Brunsma and Rockamore find no effect. Brunsma finds a negative impact of uniforms, and Young finds no effect as well. So we're getting sort of a 0 to negative impact estimate from uniforms. Stanley's paper is a bit of the exception because what she does is she's actually doing an evaluation of the Long Beach Public School District a uniform adoption procedure. Policy. But all she does there is basically compare before and after. So similar, not unrelated bias problems could exist there because she cannot separate out the impact of uniforms from other ongoing trends. So we have a lot of potential that the evidence that we have here may not be causally, may not give us a true causal estimate of what the impact of uniforms are. Yeah.
Institutional question, because I'm not up on this literature, and you may well be getting into this. Private schools. My sense of private schools is many of them have adopted school uniforms.
Yes.
Clearly, it's a different market, if you will, but will you be speaking to that? Or
so in my research, my data is entirely public school data, so I'm not going to be able to talk at all about private schools. Interestingly enough, Brunsma and Rockamore actually, there was a critique of their paper by Bodine, which expressly showed that a lot of their evidence in their paper came off of private schools themselves, and very few of their uniform analyses, their uniform impacts were coming from the public schools. But I'm going to be using some administrative data from an urban school district, so I'm not going to be able to address what impacts uniforms might have on private schools. Yeah.
Still curious about the 14% number. Do you have an equivalent number for high schools in America? Was there also a big upward trend in
I don't know.
adoption?
Yeah, I don't know what the number breakdown is by elementary and secondary school. That number is not off of my own data. That was just numbers directly from the Department of Education, a survey that the Department of Education did. So I don't know what the breakdown is of that.
Much on that, Nathan. What are your thoughts?
I would think that you'd have more motivation and expect bigger impacts from uniform adoption in high school because you have.
Well, I'm going to explicitly be looking at
problems
Right.
to begin with.
Right, like dress code violations particularly.
Right.
Well, I mean, crime,
but
violence,
yeah,
locking
for
up,
sure.
everything I would expect is more frequent among the high school population, so you could measure impacts of this policy more easily with a higher
Because the size is
baseline.
larger.
Yeah, and from society's point of view, you'd be most interested in applying it where it would have the most noticeable effect. I would
Yeah.
imagine. But I don't know, I'm just curious about why this got picked up by grade schools first.
Again, that number is kind of joined. In my paper, I'm going to explicitly look at middle and high schools separately from elementary schools. So we're going to get like separate estimates. And you are right. Your intuition is correct. It does seem to be considerable differences between the secondary school grades and the elementary grades. And what I'm going to show is actually the impacts of the uniforms tend to be somewhat larger on the secondary school grades, which is where, given the justifications for adopting uniforms, one wouldn't be surprised to see that there may be more room for movement in those situations. Yeah.
Even though you don't have the private school data, though, it's possible that the bias could be totally different. I mean, for private schools, I think the bias is going to be that private schools that have kids that do well, even if they have uniforms, it's not necessarily because the uniform is going to be that those children are a select group out of kind of the whole population, which is really different from the kind of bias that you are talking about here.
No, that's certainly the case. So there is a potential bias from the selection of the students as well. And not just in private school also, but in public schools. You could see some of that, although I think you're right that it would be more substantial in the private schools. But you could potentially see students switching in and out of schools based on whether the school has uniforms, even in a public school setting. And so we're going to try to address that in our paper through some fixed effects, student fixed effects. But that's certainly another reason why, because again, these papers can't address that issue either. Yeah, I guess I should be clear that the results I have today are going to be pretty limited to, basically, if you want to interpret the policy implication for my results, you probably want to limit it to public schools in an urban setting, in an urban setting, which is still a pretty huge substantive. I mean, a lot of huge numbers of public schools are in these large urban districts, and this is where most of the activity in terms of uniforms in the public school sector is occurring, is in the large urban districts. So certainly, I think what we're going to show today is going to be pretty widely relevant. All right, so let me kind of just give you a preview of what we do here. So we're going to use administrative data on student behavior, attendance, and test scores in the large urban school district in the Southwest. At the request of the school district, I've been required to not reveal their identity. Although if you want really, really curious, I can tell you in secret. But or you can ask Rodney because he'll just spill the beans anyway. He already knows. Yeah, you'll also figure that out pretty quickly. I'm sure most people will figure it out pretty quickly. And frankly, if you've seen my other research, it's pretty easy to figure out as well where it is. It's purely nominal. Yeah, it's purely to save my own ass, basically. So schools in LUSD, the school district, they choose whether or not and when to adopt uniforms. What we're going to do is we're going to use variation in school uniform policies over time to assess impact of uniforms on student outcomes. And so we're going to account for the endogenous uniform adoption and student switching, so there's potential causes of this bias here, through use of a combination of student fixed effects, school fixed effects, and school-specific linear time trends. So we're going to try to pull out as much of this unobservable variation that we can that could be contributing to this bias. And to try to convince you that this is going to be a sufficient procedure, we're going to give you some tests to see whether or not there is any residual trending, to try to check whether or not identification is valid. And another important issue is whether or not we're picking up just the actual uniform adoption impacts or just changes in enforcement policies. And so I'm going to try, we're going to give you some specification checks that are going to try to address this issue. So why might we think that uniforms could affect achievement, attendance, behavior? And I guess this is not too hard to kind of make an argument that there could be some effect here, but I do kind of want to run down some motivation for why schools might want to adopt uniforms. Some of the most commonly argued benefits of uniforms is that this idea that they provide regimentation and as such would instill respect for authority. So if you listen to your teachers, if you have to listen to your teachers for your uniform, you also have to, you tend to be more likely to listen to them for other reasons, or whatever. They're going to, you're not going to chew gum in class as much or things like that. A more concrete reason is that that's been argued is that it improves safety because it allows the teachers and principal and administration to identify trespassers relative to the students. And that's something that's, particularly in urban environments and high schools, is a pretty large concern. And any improvement in safety we may expect to have spillovers in terms of the students' willingness to attend school in the first place. Another argument in favor is that the students, it may make the students feel more as part of a community and reduce the pressure on the students to sort of fit in. So again, that could spill over into some attendance effects. And also it could spill over into test score effects, right? The students may feel more comfortable in their classroom environment and as a result will pay attention more in school. And this, that kind of links up to this idea that it could people have argued that instills positive attitudes and could increase self-esteem. There's also, there's this big worry about potentially like clothing competition, particularly amongst adolescent girls, where you're going to have this this need, this social pressure to dress appropriately, to dress with expensive clothes and things like that. Well, the uniforms essentially take that away because they reduce the ability for anyone to, dress in these expensive clothes, and so that could potentially reduce those social pressures.
Doesn't it just change the set of items that you use this?
Well, that's one of the arguments, right? So I don't remember who. Someone told me recently I think it was, I think actually it might have been one of my colleagues who has a daughter in a uniform school, so I had experience with this, which is, it's not so much, it may not reduce your ability, it basically may shift you to changing to other methods of expressing yourself, and so maybe different jewelry or things like that. But as we all know, everyone faces constraints, so any way you can increase those constraints is going to make the cost of actually trying to do this sort of competitive behavior larger. So, at least I would think it might have a zero effect in that kind of sense. And while it may not be quite as obvious, there are ways you can think that uniforms could potentially be detrimental. One argument has been made that by stifling students' expression, it could encourage students to rebel against authority. So if students think that kids don't like doing what adults tell them to do. So if you tell them to wear a uniform, they're going to say, maybe they'll just say no, as a way of rebellion, and that could spill over into other effects. And another possibility is that maybe a lot of focus on uniforms could distract from other disciplines. So someone I spoke to recently was saying how her experience, she'd spoken with teachers and stuff and seen things in schools before, where her experience was the teachers just spent so much time just telling the students, hey, you're not in uniform, or you need to, change your shirt or stuff like that, that, it distracts from a lot of other stuff the teachers could do. So the point of kind of putting this all out is to show that theoretically, it's not exactly clear which way uniforms could affect student achievement and student behavior and things like that. And so we need to do these empirical exercises to really find out what impact this policy has. So let me just kind of give you a brief description about the uniforms in LUSD. Schools in LUSD choose whether to require uniforms. This is going to be kind of the key to our identification strategy, which is that we don't have this sort of one-time change in uniform policy for the whole district, like you had in the Long Beach situation. Schools are adopting uniforms over time at different time periods. And so as a result, we're going to have a lot of cross-sectional and time variation in terms of schools' uniform policies. The uniform policies themselves are maybe a little looser than what we might think of as strict uniform policies. So in some respect, you could potentially think of it as a strict dress code. So generally the schools don't require you have, here's a specific shirt and pant that you must buy from the school store or from this uniform company to do. Often the schools will say, well, you have to wear a specific colored polo shirt. Students may be able to choose between 1 and 3 colors. Sometimes they'll have the shirts be a specific color related to a specific grade level, particularly in middle and high schools they tend to do that. They'll require a specific style of pant. So you have to wear khakis or denim. Girls might be permitted to wear skirts, but no ripped jeans or things like that. And sometimes they will require a shirt with a school emblem, although most of the time they don't. In general, violating the uniform policy can result in some punishments. Most of the time the punishments are relatively minor. You can get a warning or detention or something like that. But in some cases they can be more severe, particularly if repeat offenders, and can be up to getting as severe as getting an in-school suspension. So principals have a lot of leeway in terms of determining how to enforce their uniform policy, and can often provide in-school suspensions for the students. And that's going to be kind of an important thing when we get to looking at the discipline results, because our discipline measures are going to be measures of disciplinary infractions. So specifically, any infraction that ends up resulting in in-school suspension or more severe punishment is what we're going to see in our data. And so one of the complications we're going to run into is that some of what we're going to see in the discipline data could potentially be uniform violations themselves. So we're going to try to do some analysis to try to tease that out and see how much of it might be related to uniform infractions themselves and how much might be, hopefully, we can figure out is due to the impact of the policy. So this is kind of an idea of what the uniforms look like. So here's a typical LUSD school set of uniforms. And so as you can see, they have some choice in terms of the type of shirt they can wear. But generally you have a polo shirt, specific colors, khaki pants. And for most of the schools in the district, this is what type of thing you would end up seeing in terms of their uniforms. Yes, there's an actual LUSD photograph. I did not actually get these students and pose them. So here's what we have for our data. We have administrative records on individual students starting in 1993 and going through 2006. Most importantly, we're going to have disciplinary infractions for each of the students and their attendance rates, as well as Stanford Achievement Test scores starting in 1998 and going on from there. We have some set of some basic student demographics. Though, unfortunately, the one thing we were missing from our collection of the administrative data was uniform policies. So that made it a little bit of a difficulty for us. The district had information on uniform policies, but only current policies. And even then, it was only if the school was willing to actually tell them about it. So they didn't have kind of a uniform sort of, you must tell us what your policy is thing. So what we ended up doing was we ended up sending out a survey on school uniform adoption to each of the schools in LUSD. And we asked the school principals about whether they required uniforms and when they started requiring them and if there were any gaps in their uniform requirements. This is always kind of the problem when you do surveys. Most economists are not survey methodologists, and I'm certainly no exception. So, you know, the downside is, you know, you always find out, whenever you do these things, you always find out, you're like, geez, I wish I had asked that question earlier. So we kept the survey pretty limited, in part because we wanted to encourage as much participation as possible. So we didn't want to ask them for too many details. So we don't have that much information on kind of crinkles in uniform policy, variations like, you know, the color of the uniforms or things like that. What basically we have is, do you require a uniform? And if so, when was it adopted? And were there any periods since then when it was suspended? Interestingly enough, it turns out that none of the schools we got answers from ever suspended their uniform policy. Once they adopted it in perpetuity. And it's kind of funny when you think about that, because that kind of shows you a bit of a revealed preference by the schools, right? If the school, clearly that the schools at least think, and the principals at least think that this policy is useful. Because if they didn't think that was the case, you would expect to see some to adopt it and then decide, no, I'm not going to, you know, decide to abandon it. And the fact that we don't see, out of basically some 200 some odd schools, we don't see any schools switching from non-adoption to adoption. I'm sorry, the other way around. Switching from having uniforms to not having uniforms kind of does tell you a little bit about what's going on here. Yeah.
Did you distinguish between a dress code and a uniform in your survey question? Because lots of schools have dress codes. Based on, having a couple of kids, I know about the dress codes, but that is not a uniform, of course.
So what we specifically asked them was whether they required a specific type of shirt, and so the survey question was, do you require a school uniform? And by this we mean, do you require students to wear a specific type of shirt, e.g. polo shirt, with a specific color and a specific type of pant, which is generally what these uniforms were. So we tried to be, to specify exactly what we were looking for in terms of the uniforms. So I don't think we got any schools that were kind of misinterpreting what we were with kind of just a dress code policy. In fact, pretty much every school has some dress code policy. So I think what we were doing was much more detailed than that.
What was the response rate?
So I was just about to talk about the response rate. So in all of the schools that were in operation from 2007-08, we were able to get uniform information from 79% of them. For 14%, the date could not be determined. And so the problem with this was that because we had to rely on retroactive, basically the memories of the people who were in the school. And so if the principal didn't remember when the uniforms were adopted, we asked them to ask some of their staff members. But obviously, sometimes you're just not going to be able to have people remember. And sometimes they would give us kind of a range of dates. If they gave us a range of dates, or sometimes they would say, oh, well, it's been at least since this date, we asked for clarification. If we couldn't nail down a specific year, then we decide not to include that school in our analysis, because part of what we're doing here is going to really, the timing of the uniform adoption is going to be pretty important, so we want to make sure that we had as little measurement error as possible in terms of the timing of the uniform adoption. So in the end, actually we end up with, I think, a pretty good response rate, and you'll see here what the uniform adoption and our response rates look like. In the end, we ended up with getting responses from about 80% of the schools. A small number refused to give us any uniform information as well. So what you see here, the top group of schools here, these are schools that do not have uniforms. This middle light blue are the schools that do have uniforms, and this is the schools that we could not get information on. Clearly you could tell that because of the retrospective nature of our survey, you're going to get a few more schools that we don't have information on in the earlier period than the later period. But overall, it's relatively constant over time. The key thing that's going to be important for our identification here is to look at what happens with this blue, this light blue and this dark blue group. Starting in 1993, very few schools have uniforms. It's really only about 20 of the schools have uniforms. As we get to 2006, of the schools that we actually able to get a response from, 80% of them have uniforms. So we have a huge increase in uniform adoption over time in this district. And as not surprisingly, the number of schools that don't have uniforms also drops off. And total number of schools increases a bit as this is a relatively fast-growing school district as well over this time period. So here's our basic identification strategy. We're going to use a combination of school fixed effects, school-specific linear time trends, and student fixed effects to address endogenous uniform adoption by schools, and endogenous movement of students into schools with and without uniforms. So our basic model is we're going to have some outcome measure that's going to either be a test score gain measure or the discipline or attendance. And we're going to regress this on the uniform status of that school. I should also clarify that if a school told us that their uniforms were recommended but not required, we consider that to be a non-uniform school. Because essentially, if it's recommended, the students don't have to wear it, and so there's no real disciplining implementation of it. Only 3 schools actually told us that they recommended but not required uniform, but didn't require uniforms, so it shouldn't have much of an impact. We have a set of student characteristics. Not too many, because most of our student characteristics are actually going to be wiped out by the fixed effects anyway. So basically, we're going to have free reduced price lunch, other economic disadvantage, and some information on the students, whether the student was a recent immigrant. And also, we're going to have a set of grade by year fixed effects. That's all going to be subsumed in X there. S here is our school fixed effects, and why is that an L? Apparently, my Greek letters did not transfer over when I transferred to the old PowerPoint. So this W should be an omega, so this is our parameter estimates here. And then our school times time fixed effects, and here's our student fixed effect. All right, so give you an idea what this looks like. I'm also going to show, so I show here, it's split by elementary and middle and high school. Here's some means and standard deviations. We have the schools where uniforms are not required, the schools where uniforms are required, and then the schools where we weren't able to get uniform data on. And I'm going to show you these to kind of give you an idea of what we're missing from the survey. One concern is the potential that our sample is biased because of some non-random survey non-response. We're in the process now of trying an inverse probability weighting of, so we haven't run those regressions yet. Actually, my co-author should be running them right now as we speak. Hopefully, maybe she'll call me in the middle of this and tell me what the results are. But I guess I wouldn't count on that. So that's one way we're trying to see is to what extent some potential non-random selection bias might be at play here.
Why linear time trends? Why not just, you have like year dummies?
Well, you can't interact with year dummies with the school because then
so you just want to interact with the school. Okay.
Yeah. It's a linear time trend, school-specific linear time trends.
Okay.
Yeah. No, we do have year dummies in here.
Okay.
But it was to try to get at these school-specific trends. So first, I'm going to kind of look at comparing the uniform versus non-uniform schools. Surprisingly, they're actually not all that different. For the elementary school, you see most things are pretty similar in terms of the uniform and not uniform. And for the middle and high school, I think it was, you do get some, for the middle and high school students, you do get some more free and reduced price lunch there. So for the middle and high schools, the uniform schools tend to be somewhat poorer. The fact that these differences aren't that big is not all that surprising, considering that by the end of our sample, most of the schools end up adopting uniforms. So you get a pretty nice spread of schools that at some point end up adopting uniforms as a result of this. this is kind of in contrast to what you see in sort of the previous papers where you have these OLS estimates that seem to suggest that uniforms are being adopted by schools with more problems. In terms of the schools we don't have data on, again, not too different. They do seem to be, in terms of the elementary schools, somewhat poorer than the schools we do have data on, but other than that, relatively similar. So we're pretty confident that that's not much of a problem in terms of the descriptive statistics. When we turn to the outcomes, though, we do see some considerable differences. So these top three are the Stanford scores and standard deviation units. So we're standardizing these scores across we're standardizing the scale scores across the district. And then we have disciplinary infractions over here and attendance rate over here. For elementary students, the uniforms schools seem to have considerably lower test scores than the non-uniform schools. So it does seem that there may be some of this test score selection going on in the elementary schools. Interestingly, the unknown schools also have even further lower test scores. It's possible, it's not clear why exactly this is. It's possible that it could just be because of the recollection, because of the recollective nature of our survey, that we have more missing observations in the early years of our sample than the later years. And test scores over time in this district tend to have, actually, I guess that shouldn't, I should rephrase that. Shouldn't make effect because these are actually standardized within school, within grade and year. So actually, scratch that. That probably isn't one of the reasons that's going on there. So yeah, it could be some evidence of some sort of.
Would that be true if you had higher turnover at these schools that have lower test scores, and there's the higher turnover means you have less recollection, and so they're not going to be included?
That could be it, yeah. If you have more staff turnover, that could be part of what's going on there. Yeah. And to the extent, unfortunately, we're stuck with the survey data we have. To the extent that our measures may be essentially measuring a subset of the district, I don't think it's much of a problem when you're trying to look at more generally what's happening here, because again, an urban district itself is already a pretty sub-selected sample. So if we subselect a little bit more by excluding a few schools, some of the lower end, potentially lower end schools, I don't think it makes that much of a difference in terms of whatever implications are. Given that, I don't think this doesn't. Given that we have this subset of schools, within the subset of schools, this shouldn't have any impact on the causal implications of the estimates within that subset. But it does potentially have implications for wider analysis. But again, hopefully we're going to do that inverse probability weighting exercise, and hopefully it shouldn't, and I don't expect it to really be all that much different than what we find in our main estimates.
Instead of asking the principals, I would suggest, based on my experience, that you ask the president of the PTA. They know everything about the schools. We have a couple of those here, that's what I'm commenting about.
That probably would have been a good idea. Well, next time I do the survey, we'll do that. Again, one of those things where you always find out that the questions you should have asked after you've already done the survey. So anyway, but in general, we do see that the uniform schools have somewhat lower test scores than the elementary and middle school students, and pretty similar test scores in middle and high school. Interesting thing is looking at the disciplinary infractions. This is kind of what we expect to see, that the uniform schools in middle and high school have more disciplinary infractions than the non-uniform schools.
But not many more than the unknown in middle high school, because
Right, yeah, it's not that many more than that.
it seems to me that you do have some systematic differences between those unknowns and the others.
Yeah. No, I wouldn't deny that there are some systematic
A
differences.
little higher African American populations, a little lower socioeconomic status stuff, and more more disciplinary actions.
Yeah. So unfortunately, the best we can do with that is to see what happens when we do this reweighting exercise and see what happens to the results there, and hopefully those would turn out pretty similar. But that's the best we can do in terms of that.
So we're about a third of our time left, so we might want to get to the
Well, okay, here we are.
rock on.
Here are the results. So I'm going to start by talking about the impacts on the behavior and the attendance, and then going to move on to the test scores after that. It's kind of the opposite of what you usually do in education analyses. Usually people like the test scores first, But I think when you're talking about uniforms, generally people tend to think of the first order effects as being, what the behavioral effects on the students. So I think it's important to look at that first. So first, let's start with elementary students. So because some of the schools have overlapping, have both elementary and middle school grades, instead of doing the school level separation, we separate our analysis by the grades of the students. So we do grades 1 through 5 for our elementary students and grades 6 through 12 for our middle and high school students. On the left, you have basic OLS estimates. Just for comparison, essentially this is kind of what the previous literature would have done, similar to the estimates done by the previous literature. And on the right are primary estimates that include the school, student, and student fixed effects and the school-specific linear time trends. For elementary students, there's not that much going on in disciplinary infractions. In some sense, that's not surprising because elementary students get very few suspensions in the first place, and so we wouldn't expect to see that much room for action here. We do see... you cluster on school? Yeah, clustered by school. We do see a significant reduction in attendance for males. I'm going to leave this for a moment and come back to it later. It turns out that if you look over time since adoption, so if you go like 1 or 2 years after adoption, this result ends up going away. So, and what we're going to end up finding in the end is that at least for males, there appears to be maybe some sort of a bit of an adjustment period to the uniforms that after a couple of years essentially dissipates. More interesting, I think, is what's going on in the middle and high school. And here's where we really see some interesting potential impacts of uniforms. So if we look at girls, we notice that there's a pretty large and significant increase in attendance rates. So this is a half of a percentage point. And if you were to translate that into days of school, it's essentially roughly about 1 extra day of school per year, or about 7% of mean attendance for the 7% of the mean absence rate for these students. So it's I guess a moderate improvement, but nonetheless a pretty highly significant one and a pretty substantial one for a policy that's not really all that expensive of a policy to implement. We see a weaker but still similar effect for males. Males do seem to get higher attendance in middle and high school as a result of the uniforms. When we turn to disciplinary infractions, this was kind of one of the surprising things we saw, which was that it seems like the disciplinary infractions increase. And so our first concern with this was, well, maybe this is, uniforms coming in at the same time that you have some sort of a crackdown on bad behavior, some sort of a change in enforcement policy occurring at the same time. Sorry? Or uniform nitpicking. Right, or uniform nitpicking. That was the other thing we were thinking of, which is maybe a lot of this is coming out of the uniforms themselves, that violations of the uniforms resulting in more disciplinary infractions. Unfortunately, our data is not detailed enough to actually see the specific reason for the infraction, whether or not it's a uniform infraction, but we do have some detail that we're going to be able to exploit. Yeah.
What is the distribution of the disciplinary infractions?
So in general, roughly about 10% of the students have 1 or more infractions, and then you get, and as you get higher and higher, it gets considerably smaller. So it's a pretty skewed distribution.
So it's, why did you use OLS?
The problem is that, so ideally you might want to use a count model. Yeah, but then the problem becomes what happens when you start adding the fixed effects to the count models and the and clustering the standard errors. It gets very difficult. A conditional, I'm trying to think. Is there a count? Because I know you can do a conditional logit.
You can do a selection on a count model too. So just 0, 1, and then the next thing is.
We did try. Did we try the?
And then like an OLS type of thing on the continuous part. Or on the continuous part with the selection to correct for the fact that you got all those 0. I mean, because that's got to do something.
Yeah, well, but again,
the difficulty.
The difficulty again is incorporating the fixed effects, and incorporating the fixed effects into a count model is pretty problematic because then you run into the incidental parameters problem.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, LIMDEP, I know, or NLogit will handle that.
But it's not a true fixed effect. It's different.
You can't sweep out. You basically can't sweep out.
Right, you have to actually model the fixed effects when you use that. And also, I've tried doing like NLogit. If anyone's actually figured out how to do cluster standard errors in those things, I can't. It doesn't seem like Stata doesn't let you do it, and I'm not sure how to actually model it myself. We did try some. I'm trying to remember. We did try some. I think some linear probability models. Just using the 1, 0, and we found similar results with that. Obviously, that doesn't address the count problem, but it's still kind of another specification that looks at this measure. Yeah. Go ahead.
So for the nitpicking, uniform nitpicking, I noticed earlier you mentioned that there could be one dress color or 3. And if you know about that, then if it's only one dress color, then it's easier to notice who is not having that. So it's easier to. So that might be able to get you out of this problem with it.
Oh, you mean like instrument for it with the number of with the flexibility of the policy?
Or even just yeah.
That's not a bad idea.
Scott, what's the unit that you're using on attendance rate? What does that 0.271 mean?
That is a percentage point. So that's 3/10 of a percentage point of the attendance rate.
You know what, I have the same question about the behavior measure.
Hold on one second, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, because the attendance rates are very similar across schools. I mean, it's 96.7 to 96.3 or something, and so.
So the
it seemed like
mean attendance rate for the middle and high schools is roughly around 93%. It's better actually to think of it in terms of absences, so kind of think of the negative of it.
Just one day, that's what I mean. Is it
Yeah, so basically both of these are, actually this is probably roughly about half a day and this is about 1 day. The discipline, the unit is a number of infractions per year. So this would be 1/1300ths of an infraction. So one infraction per 10 students or something like that. With 30. Okay, I'll remember that later. Couldn't remember the word. Anyway, so I'm going to try and do now. How much time do I have left?
10 minutes.
Okay.
10 minutes max.
So I'm going to try to do now quickly is try to piece out what's going on with that discipline result. So one thing we're worried about is this change in enforcement thing. And so there are a couple ways we try to get at this. One thing we try to do is to incorporate principal fixed effects. So we're going to essentially account for characteristics of the principal that may be correlated with their likelihood of adopting uniforms. Perhaps the principal is a strict disciplinarian and he likes very strict discipline, and at the same time he's going to adopt uniforms to implement that. And when we incorporate the principal fixed effects, we don't see much of a difference. Our attendance results remain pretty much the same. Actually get a little stronger in this case. Oh, I forgot to change this again. I'm sorry. This got screwed up. This is I copied the middle and high school twice. So, but if you can take my word for it, the elementary results are pretty similar as well. Here are the middle high results. So we get similar things for attendance. In terms of discipline, this significant discipline number becomes insignificant, but doesn't drop by that much. These are not going to be statistically significantly different from each other. So incorporating the principal fixed effects doesn't seem to change our results all that much. A second thing we did, and I'm not going to show you the results here, but we also tried estimates that provide separate impact estimates for new principals who have been at the school for 2 years or less, when the uniforms were adopted, and for principals who had been for the school 2 years or more when the uniforms were adopted. So one concern there is that, well, maybe new principals are more likely to adopt uniforms as part of an overall package of reforms, and older principals who've been at school longer, maybe just put it in more piecemeal. And we don't see any statistically significant differences between those two. There was actually one test score estimate that was statistically significantly different, but other than that, we don't see much going on there. So it seems that the impacts don't differ all that much for new or existing principals. This kind of gets at a bit, I guess, at both of those issues, both the enforcement issue and also the issue of how much of this is coming from just uniform policy violations themselves. And so what we do here is we separate out the discipline violations by whether they're in-school suspensions or out-of-school suspensions. This is what most of what we have is. There's about 4% or so of the observations that are more severe, which means being transferred to an alternative discipline program or being expelled from school. So the vast majority of our identification is coming off of these whether the student's getting an in-school or out-of-school suspension. And we actually see that the increase is all coming from in-school suspensions, which kind of suggests to us that a lot of this is coming from the uniform violations themselves, because we wouldn't expect the uniform violations to have much of an impact on out-of-school suspensions. And in fact, the out-of-school suspensions seem to drop off. We get actually a significant reduction in out-of-school suspensions. So if this was being caused by enforcement, we would tend to expect, if the uniforms were coming in at the same time as enforcement, we would tend to expect there to be some increase in the out-of-school suspension as well, that the enforcement would be more uniform across the discipline distribution. In fact, we might even expect some punishments that would have gotten in-school suspensions before to now be getting out-of-school suspensions if enforcement is being heated up. And so in fact, we see the opposite. Out-of-school suspensions going down, suggesting that the uniforms, if at the very least, might be shifting the distribution of infractions to less severe infractions, and may actually, if we take into account the uniform violations themselves, may actually be reducing infractions overall. Okay. Again, I mentioned before, we have this issue with over time. If we look after the initial adoption year at future years, and then look at future years, we see that there may have been an initial period of adjustment to the uniform. So when we back in the elementary, we found that negative effect on male elementary attendance, and by the time we get 2 years out, that effect disappears. So it seems to be just the initial timing of the uniform adoption may have some impact on attendance, but then it peters out. And this is actually the case for all of the negative effects we find. In fact, this discipline effect also essentially disappears by the time we end up 2 years out. However, the attendance impacts seem to essentially stick around. We get less precision because the standard errors get bigger, but yet 2 years after adoption, the impact on attendance is virtually the same as the initial year of adoption, and virtually the same to our overall estimate. So it seems that the improvement in attendance do last for multiple years after the school adopts uniforms. Okay. So this is just summarizing the stuff I just told you before. So bottom line is we think we're picking up the actual effect of uniforms themselves and not just, it's possible enforcement could still play a bit of a role, but we think for the most part we're picking up the impact of the uniforms themselves. Okay. I also want to address our identification strategy itself. It's hard to get that many good tests of identification strategy when you're dealing with these panel data contexts. We thought that the one good test that we could do was to look at whether or not there's any residual trending after we account for our fixed effects and our school-specific linear time trends. So can we still sense any pre-trend, find any pre-trends before schools adopt uniforms? So here we have the estimates relative to the year immediately prior to uniform adoption to see if any of these discipline attendance results differ substantially and have some decrease or increasing pattern over time. We don't see any evidence of this in the elementary students for attendance or for discipline. For the middle and high students, the only significant estimate we get is 4 or more years prior to adoption for the males. And so at that point, it was the disciplinary infraction was significantly smaller. But other than that, nothing else is statistically significant here. So we have very little evidence to suggest that there's any residual trending after accounting for our fixed effect strategies. Okay. Achievement. I guess I'm sorry if it's 5 minutes left and this is what you guys are waiting for, but here it is. So we have Stanford gain scores. So we take the year-on-year gain for the Stanford scores. We don't see all that much of an effect on achievement in elementary school. There's some marginal improvement in females for the language test scores. That ends up, I think I'll probably skip, we'll see what that is. But anyway, that ends up going away if we look again over time. That's only really in the first year after adoption, then it tends to disappear. We do see some stuff going on in the middle and high schools. And again, not surprisingly, our action is coming from the middle and high schools here. Of course, this is grade 6 to 11 because we don't have 12th grade test scores, unlike with the discipline results where we did have 12th grade. We do see a pretty substantial and significant improvement in language scores for girls in middle and high school grades. So we see an improvement of about 0.05 of a standard deviation after uniforms are adopted, and which is, I guess, modest but pretty decent impact on test scores. If we look over time, actually you see a much richer picture here. This female impact on language scores sticks around, so this seems to be pretty permanent. But we also see that 2 years after adoption, we start getting some improvements in math scores as well for both the males and females. And so over the long run, it seems actually the uniforms do generate some improvements in math scores. And so here we have improvements of roughly about 1/10 of a standard deviation after that time period. We did the same set of specification tests for the test scores as we did for the discipline. The results for the test scores were somewhat not quite as robust as they were for the discipline results. However, I guess our first concern was really that a lot of the selection was being driven off the discipline anyway. The principal fixed effects results provides qualitatively similar results, although our one estimate in terms of the high school girls becomes statistically insignificant. There was some residual trending for middle and high reading, but not for other test scores or grades. So in general, it still seems to be pretty good, and we're pretty confident that our identification strategy is really getting rid of a lot of the unobserved variation. The final thing we did, and this was actually kind of one of the surprising things we found, and it was actually turned out to be pretty interesting, is we were wondering about, initially we came out of this from a view of, whether student movements may be affecting our estimates. And then we started thinking about, actually from a different point of view, which is that actually student movements is a potential interesting outcome from the adoption of uniforms. And what we were surprised to find was that for girls, schools that adopted uniforms were much better at keeping the students in the school district. They were essentially, and so one of the characteristics that's important to know about the school district, given the context, is that there are a lot of charter schools around, and there are a lot of private schools. And in fact, there are about 10 or 11 suburban school districts surrounding it. And so you have a lot of options for school choice in this area, more than you have in most urban districts. And so while we can't see exactly where these students are going, it's probably a safe bet that a lot of them are going to charter schools and potentially to private schools as well. And so we see that for girls in elementary school, they're about 0.7 of a percentage point less likely to leave the school district. And for middle and high school, about 1.2 percentage points less likely to leave the school district after uniform adoption. And I should mention also, we throw out the transition grades here. So we're only looking at, on the one hand, transition grades is where people are more likely to switch around, but on the other hand, the uniform status of your current school is not going to matter if you're transitioning to another school. So this is really only within non-transition grade movements. So given that, actually, that we're not looking at the transition grade, this is actually a pretty substantial result here. And so the bottom line out of this is that actually suggests that uniforms could be a potential way for schools to compete against, for public schools to compete against charter schools and things like that, to basically attract their students, particularly girls. In some respect, it's not surprising that you see this effect for girls more than for boys, because I guess because, okay, I guess I don't have a girl, so I don't know, I have a boy. But I would imagine that parents of girls might be more worried about the school environment than the boys are. Of course, I could be wrong. My boy's only not in school yet, so it doesn't make that much of a difference.
I mean, very, very roughly speaking, I think you could say at the elementary school level, girls are a little bit better behaved. That they're more respectful of authority, more likely to sort of follow rules and not be. That's a very general statement. It's
I don't want to go too far with this
saying
because it is
that every
generalized.
elementary school girl is better behaved than every
No, but
elementary
on
school boy.
average, I think.
But on average, behavior-wise, yeah.
But fashion conscious too.
Well, clearly, girls are,
Yeah. So to the extent that boys might have worse behavior, I don't know, I think it might be some sort of
yeah.
desire by the parents of girls not to get that undue influence.
Scott, you're speaking as if these students are transitioning to another school district, but in high school, they may be actually dropping out of school, right?
Yeah, so that's one of the problems here. Where do you track? So I looked at dropout. We had dropout data and I looked at it and didn't see any difference. The problem here is that our district, the district we're using, had some problems with their dropout data in the past. So because of the historical issues with dropout data, I didn't want to use that, so we had to kind of essentially just leave it to all leavers. But you're all right that this could be part of this could be dropout prevention. Yeah, it could be reducing dropouts. Yeah, which is right. Even better. I mean, that's all, as far as the schools are concerned. That's a very important policy that a very important issue in the schools is reducing the dropouts. But yeah, unfortunately, because of data quality issues, we can't separate that out. For what? There is, but I don't have it. I could get it. I could potentially get it. Well, I'm sure if I asked nicely enough, I could probably get it as well from my from my anonymous school district. So let me just wrap up. But actually, it would be interesting to hear after the talk some more of your thoughts for why we might be getting those lack of that shift into leavers. One thing we did look into was whether or not there were any specific types of students who were leaving. It was hard to find evidence of that. We kind of tried to interact the uniform status with the students' test scores, their discipline, their characteristics. We didn't see any difference so we didn't see that the test scores interaction had any impact on whether you're less likely to leave, or the discipline, or anything like that. The one thing we did see was that in elementary school, for girls, gifted students were less likely to leave the district when the schools adopted uniforms. Oddly enough, for boys, special ed students were less likely to leave the district in elementary school when they adopted uniforms. So I'm not sure what to make of that, but so I guess we tried to make some sort of a peer effect argument that maybe it does suggest that potentially part of what we're seeing in the uniform effects may be working through peer effects, at least with the girls. That was kind of one tantalizing thing, but we couldn't really get much more into what's going on there. We just weren't able to see much more going on there. So in conclusion, we do find the school uniforms are pretty effective at improving various aspects of student performance, particularly amongst attendance and some test score measures, and particularly for girls. Our largest impact seemed to be that the girls themselves, and middle and high school girls in particular, were the ones most affected by uniforms and generally in a positive direction. Boys were had improvements.
Point that sort of fits in with a few findings from the literature, like moving opportunity, sort of, and Anderson's work also. If you look at the Perry preschool, also basically says that basically all the effects you get are for girls.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, MTOs.
That's a good point. I forgot about that. I should incorporate that.
I think boys are just screwed. Nothing we can do.
Well, but the plus side is that I don't actually find, when you look at the overall evidence that we find, I don't find really bad effects for the boys. Yeah, initially there may be some adjustment, but over time the boys seem to do pretty well too, and they still got the improvements in the math scores, and they still ended up with some attendance improvements. And so the middle high school boys in the end also seem to benefit, just not as much as the girls did. And even though we do see an increase in the disciplinary infraction, the severity of disciplinary infractions seems to fall, and a lot of the increase seems likely to be due to the uniform infractions themselves. So on net, it seems like discipline itself improves as well. So I guess I'm right out of time now, so thank you very much.
Great, thank you.